My guest at this time is Dr. Roy Spencer, Principal Research Scientist at the University of Alabama-Huntsville. He is also the author of ebooks such as Inevitable Disaster, Why Hurricanes Can't Be Blamed on Global Warming, and Global Warming Skepticism for Busy People. We've asked him to comment on the United Nations Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change issuing a dire warning that climate change may take us past the tipping point by 2030 unless leaders around the globe take sweeping action to mitigate the warming of the planet. And Dr. Spencer, thanks so much for being with us.
And thanks for having me.
What was your initial response to seeing this report that we've essentially got 12 years to stave off climatological changes that we might never recover from?
Well, my initial reaction is that the less people listen to the IPCC, it seems like the louder they have to scream, because this report is even more alarmist than previous reports, making it sound like, that it's really imperative to keep future warming below 2 degrees, and we got to get it down to 1.5 degrees. And there's all different ways we could look at this, but basically the science doesn't support the idea that we are even going to warm by that much, let alone that we could prevent that warming from occurring. I think we are going to reach 1.5 degrees, but to reduce carbon dioxide emissions, the amount they're talking about, it's basically physically impossible. We cannot replace fossil fuels at the level that's required to achieve what they are trying to achieve.
You touched on so many important points there, so let me try to follow up on them one at a time. First of all, you talked about the projections of the IPCC. What's been their track record over the past 25 to 30 years?
Well, basically, they use these climate models, that run on computers. And they go basically according to the average of all the climate models. That's the basis for their projections of how much it's going to warm in the future and how much it should have warmed in the past. Basically, those projections are off by almost a factor of 2. In other words, those models are warming up the Earth twice as fast as has been observed since, let's say, the 1950s. Okay, and when I say the Earth warming, the climate system warming, I'm talking about the combination of the deep ocean and the atmosphere, because you have to look at the whole system together. And if you put all of that together, the models are warming things too fast. A second point is they assume all of the warming is due to humans, when in fact, I would say up to 50% of it could be natural warming, because we had warming in the first half of the 20th century. And then we've seen warming in the second half of the 20th century. Well, the warming, 100 years ago couldn't have been our fault. So how do they know that it's entirely our fault now? Well, they don't know. So when you put all of these things together, I think the amount of warming we will see in the future is less than what they're projecting, and I'm guessing by about 50%. So in other words, we only have half the problem that they're talking about. And then beyond that, we can talk about all of their exaggerations about worsening weather, droughts, floods, all of that. If you look at the data, that stuff has not happened yet.
So what is responsible for whatever warming there is? You're suggesting it's not nearly as significant as they say it is. Is it merely cyclical? Do you believe humans play any role in this? How should we view the fact that it has gone up at least a little?
I do believe that humans play a role. I believe that the CO2 we're adding to the atmosphere does cause some warming. I believe that the latest best estimate, best evidence, there's some recent work that's been done in the last year that's been published, suggests that the amount of warming we should see from a doubling of carbon dioxide, which will occur late in this century, will be about 1.5 degrees. So, yes, I do believe that humans do have an influence, that some of the warming, probably more than half of it, in my mind, if I had to guess, I think more than half of the warming we've seen is due to humans, but it's not that much warming anyway. These reports, like this one that was just released by the IPCC, come out with gross exaggerations and attributions to humans, which just cannot be. You can't show that humans have caused increasing droughts, increasing floods, increasing hurricanes, because none of that stuff has happened. This stuff, we have statistics on all of this, and they are, I hate to say it, but I think they are just making things up. Just because something bad happened in, wildfires in Northern California, okay, that doesn't prove anything. Globally, wildfires are down substantially. Wildfires in the western U.S. are down substantially. Hurricanes. Basically, there's been no long-term change in global hurricane activity. So there's very little that they can point to in the way of changes that have occurred, let alone due to humans. Even if there were changes, we wouldn't be able to say how much was due to natural cycles in the climate system versus humans. So there's just so many things that are wrong with this report. It's basically fear-mongering.
Dig a little deeper, if you can, Dr. Spencer, into the 1.5 degrees Celsius that they see as the key benchmark here. You mentioned a moment ago that you believe that it's not nearly that significant. It's probably about half that. But is that a significant benchmark in any way, either the 1.5 or the 2%, which they say would be catastrophic?
No, they're making it sound like there are tipping points. That we've got to keep it to 1.5 degrees, that 1.5 degrees will be so much better than 2 degrees. And there's no evidence I've seen that suggests that there's any kind of tipping point. Just that the warmer it gets, probably the worse it will be for, some aspects of the world, of the biosphere or for humanity. It's just sort of a continuum. If it warmed by 10 degrees C, I would admit that's a bad thing, okay? Probably a very bad thing for some people. But we're not talking about that. We're talking about 1.5 degrees C, maybe 2 degrees C. Okay, these are things that people can cope with. The cost of preventing half a degree C of warming, remember, they're trying to get the limit from 2 degrees down to 1.5 degrees. Would require such a huge cutback in fossil fuel use that it would greatly exacerbate poverty around the world. Already, tens of thousands of people are dying from energy poverty during the winter, and that's going to get massively worse. Okay, if there's one thing we know that kills people in the world, it's poverty. And what the IPCC wants to do, and the United Nations wants to do, is tax carbon-based fuels, coal, natural gas, petroleum, at such a large extent that we will only have access to very expensive fuel sources, wind and solar, which are still quite a bit more expensive than carbon-based fuels. And since everything requires energy, everything we do, every single thing humans do requires energy, it's going to make all of humanity poorer, and poverty kills.
The BBC report on this expands on that just a little bit. It says dealing with it will be hugely expensive, but the window of opportunity remains open. And then it goes on to say we can stay below it, meaning the 1.5 Celsius temperature guardrail, as the IPCC calls it, but it will require urgent large-scale changes from governments and individuals, and we will have to invest a massive pile of cash every year, about 2.5% of global gross domestic product, the value of all goods and services produced for 2 decades. And so this will not only leave us energy poor, it's going to have a significant impact on our economy in general, it sounds like.
Yes. And, for instance, Bjorn Lomborg, years ago, brought together some of the world's best economists, some of which are Nobel laureates, who said even if global warming ends up being bad, let's say in the next 50 to 100 years, he assumed the IPCC models were correct. And he said it still makes more sense to adapt for humanity because it would be so horrendously expensive that you're going to kill way more people trying to save them from global warming just by making them so poor.
Last question for you, Dr. Spencer. I'm sure you get this question all the time. The folks at the IPCC and folks elsewhere, politicians certainly, say that it's settled science, that this is a crisis, that this is coming to a head, and that responsible nations, responsible people need to acknowledge that, accept it, and deal with it, and basically label folks with your position and others like you as being on the fringe. What do you say in rebuttal to that?
Well, there's no question that scientists like myself are in the minority, but we're certainly not global warming deniers. I don't know anybody in this field that's on my side of the issue that doesn't believe that humans cause some warming. It's a matter of how much. Okay, it's a matter of degree of how much warming. So when they say it's settled science, the only part of all of this I've ever seen that's actually, I would call settled science, is that as we add CO2 to the atmosphere, there should be some warming. Beyond that, everything else is uncertain. The amount of warming, how it's going to affect weather systems, and so far we've seen no negative impacts that we can trace to increasing CO2. In fact, we've seen positive impacts. There's global greening that we've witnessed in recent decades from Earth orbiting satellites, especially in some arid areas and semi-arid areas. More CO2, it looks like, is going to be good for life on Earth. So, and this is part of the debate that they don't want to have. They don't want to, they don't want to talk about the benefits of more CO2. And they want to make it sound like, CO2 is responsible for everything bad that happens that we see in nature. And it's just a huge exaggeration, and I think their motivations are not pure.
Dr. Spencer, very interesting, very informative. Thank you, sir, very much for your time today.
You're welcome.
Dr. Roy Spencer, Principal Research Scientist at the University of Alabama-Huntsville, also the author of ebooks such as Inevitable Disaster, Why Hurricanes Can't Be Blamed on Global Warming, and Global Warming Skepticism for Busy People. I'm Greg Columbus reporting for Radio America.